What's up? About what King said, the bootless man, understanding that. So we, the people, are pissed. And because a lot of people don't understand what that means, I assembled a panel of really diverse and wise men. And I'm going to introduce the panel real quick. Scotty Smarts. He's a young activist. I've been knowing him for about 2 years now. He is really doing amazing work in the community. He's not just on the front line fighting against injustices. You talking about he's he's partying. He's having parties on Saturdays and Sundays. Waking up Monday morning, grabbing a group of people, taking them job training, getting them certified for jobs. He does food drives. He does school drives. We had a problem with a bus in a low-income school. They didn't have a lot of money. Scotty called me. We organized the money. We got the school money for this actual repair for the bus. He's really doing amazing work in the neighborhood. So I definitely wanted Scotty on this panel. I got Mitch. Mitch is also giving back to community. He does a lot of mentoring shits with kids in the community. Most of these people on the panel are from the community. Not everybody's from the community. I think it's real important to have voices from the community now actually giving back to community. I also have Councilman Thompson on the panel as well. He is definitely an excellent asset to this panel. Not only he's from the projects, he understands the needs of the poor community. Now he's a councilman. He's serving the community on a much broader level. So I appreciate him for taking the time to come out. I know he has a busy schedule. He just won the election. As he was saying earlier, he was in training this whole week, and he came back and he was willing to come on this panel. So I definitely appreciate that. I got Kenny. Kenny, he says, I'm just a guy. Kenny's a guy who I call him a historian. He really has a great interest in history. So when we have these conversations, he's coming from a historical perspective. He travels the country. He's constantly studying on history. So he brings a different dynamics. So what I did was today, we wanted to talk about the things that King said, because when I'm talking to a lot of my friends who are, and this is crazy that I noticed this. It seems like a lot of people from the right, always when we start talking about the problems that we have, they call it a victim mentality, being a victim. And I'm always reiterating, there's a cause and effect factor. And they're always trying to discredit about what happened a long time ago. They say everything's fair, nobody's in slavery right now. But they don't understand, because of what happened now has a direct impact on how we are living day to day. So I wanted to bring this panel together and have a discussion in reference to this particular topic. I invited, you could take 10 people in this live stream. The three people who give me the most pushback on the victimless mentality versus the bootless man, they all canceled out last minute, but we still want to have a good conversation. The video that we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to show it. Go ahead, Dave, show the video, and then we'll dive right into the conversation.
The fact that Negroes are black.
White America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation. of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Now, thanks, Dave. Now, I guess the question to the panel is the bootless man versus the victim mentality. Does anybody want to chime in reference to the bootless man? Does anybody know what that means?
Well, what I was going to say is that what he's referencing is the Homestead Act, which was enacted prior to the abolition of slavery. And so the Homestead Act allowed people to basically go get land, and land the size of Texas and California was essentially open to the public, but you had to meet a whole bunch of criteria in order to get that. And so there was a disadvantage after the Civil War. If you didn't meet this criteria, you couldn't get the land. And so what he's talking about then is once slavery was over with, how many slaves had the money to make it happen and take advantage of the Homestead Act? Not very many. And so there wasn't anything to pass down to other generations. However, if you came in from overseas, if you were an immigrant, you could take advantage, and you knew about the Homestead Act. You had the ability to take advantage of that.
Right. So are we fair to say that at that time period has a huge impact on how we are operating today?
And I'd like to add, immediately after slavery, many of the slaves had to return back to the plantations, as sharecroppers. 40 acres and a mule never materialized. And, when we look at land as the basis of wealth, those who were freed from the plantations never got the land from which to build wealth, generational wealth. So I guess the bootstrap concept is the lack of access to capital, the lack of access to wealth that one passes from generation to generation, in order to build wealth and in order to live life as comfortable as one wishes. We definitely is great for us to look at the historical accounts of slavery and what slavery meant, what it meant to those who enslaved Africans, and what it meant for Africans who were enslaved by others. Those who enslaved Africans were able to build wealth from what they planted on the plant, what they cultivated on the plantation, whether it was sugar, rice, whether it was cotton, whatever the case may be. So while they had that 244-year, 400-year advantage over us, we never had the opportunity they had to build generational wealth. Hence, the reason why the wealth gap right now is 10 times lower for us than it is for those who, were, part of that enslavement system.
So I would agree with both Mr. Thompson and Ken. I mean, the bootless strap notion is really talking about the systemic issues that Black Americans face, right? We talk about, he mentioned economic base. And so how can you tell a group of people to lift themselves up when they virtually had nothing to lift themselves up by, no housing, right? There was no making of the whole to the Black community, right? There was no blueprint on how we move forward. And so to say this pull up your bootstrap was very short-sighted, to say that to a community that's been oppressed and systemically discriminated against for, as he mentioned, 244 years, and it went on for another 100+ years with Jim Crow and Black codes, et cetera. So, so that's the bootstrap theory, as the way I understand it.
So how do you feel when you hear someone use the terminology when you're acknowledging this problem? Because can we all agree, right? It was never made right. So we're unbalanced right now. So when you hear somebody this day and age says you just have the victim mindset, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think to me, I think it's a little dog whistling with that statement, right? Because they're assuming that as a community, as a culture, as the Black community who's been systemically oppressed and discriminated against for 400 years, that somehow you can personally, individually climb your way out without the resources and opportunities that other of our counterparts have been given, right? So I think it just falls short into really proposing real solutions that can move a community that's been oppressed forward by assuming that you could just individually lift yourself out of poverty without any community resources or opportunity. So I just think it's a little offensive. I think it's short-sighted to solutions.
I think when somebody says that, one of the things that's amazing about this country is the fact that we've got short memories. I think that's a great thing, but it's also a bad thing. The fact that we have short memories. So we think that the history of we're living in the history of today without really understanding, what took place, prior to this, 100 years prior to this, 50 years prior to this, 200 years prior to this, and how does that impact and build to where we are today. So that statement is sort of, I see it as a lack of understanding, or not knowledge, a lack of understanding of history. I mean, you even go back to the fact that after the Civil War, you had communities that where they were slaves, and then their children were building wealth. And it's called the Red Summer in 1919. A lot of Black communities in what were called race riots, it was really more of a massacre, was destroyed. There was a lot of Black wealth too that was destroyed in that time period. So you had people coming out of slavery who were making their own way, overcoming tons of obstacles, building wealth. And Black Wall Street in Tulsa is probably the most famous example of this. In today's dollars, you had in Tulsa about $6 billion of wealth destroyed. Now, imagine if that $6 billion you were able to build on that. Some people think, well, probably about $60 billion today. If the wealth was able to stay there and it wasn't destroyed. So there's a lot of factors that happen along the way between slavery and today that people just they may not be aware of it. I mean, I'd like to give somebody the benefit of the doubt. I'll say that they aren't aware of it. They're ignorant of history, because this isn't history necessarily that you learn in high school. This is history that you have to go and search for. You have to hunt for this stuff, unless you're taking specific classes in college.
See, Ken bring up a great point.
I think something that's often overlooked within the history conversation is a conversation about Freeman's Bank, and which is the banking system right after slavery that was only allowed for Black people as free people to go to this bank. And it got to a point over the first 10 years of Reconstruction, right after slavery. It's really a time frame where people don't like to have an educational conversation about when we were actually thriving. We had 100,000 people. We had 37 different branches of banking. But at that time frame, right after slavery, these banks were governed by 50 white men that made the decisions that actually caused the bank to shut down within a 10 years time without any reimbursement to any of the original people of that bank. And so when we talk about the historical context of it, it's the beginning of the Black people not trusting the banking system, and then which leads into a history of systematic oppression through black codes where you had to work for white people, that was illegal. So a lot of the times, the reason why people can try to put in a victim mindset for today's situations because they try to deflect on how recent history is, and not just to say it was so long ago, when 1965, 1970 wasn't that long ago. And a lot of times you have people who are in power in this country right now who were brought up and raised in that era. You know, if you look at the details and you line up history with Ruby Bridges and segregation, Ruby Bridges is only 67 years old. And so that time frame produced a lot of today's leaders, as far as government leaders and government officials that were raised by people. I would say the average person lawmaking in this country is 55 to 75, in that range. And so they either were raised within Jim Crow, or their parents were raising them, or were the parents of Jim Crow that thought it was okay to go watch these lynchings and push so much hate into the culture. So you're one generation removed from segregation. And I think that's a missed concept, because people don't like to really just be transparent about the hatred and the deep roots of racism in America.
Go ahead.
The gentleman mentioned Black Wall Street, and you think of the assets that were destroyed in that massacre: a 750-seat theater, grocery stores, dentist offices. This was a community that was kept on the south side of Tulsa in Greenwood that were not allowed to go to the north side because they were Blacks. And they created that affluent community and the wealth in their community, which was destroyed ultimately and intentionally because there was envy that here's this community of Black folks growing this affluent community, and this was not supposed to happen. You look at Wilmington, North Carolina, Rosewood, Florida, and so many different communities that this happened to, you know? So not having the access to capital, the access to wealth, the access to fair housing policies, the access to moving up in corporate or in your workplace where you can acquire a higher position with a higher salary. In turn, you can use that now to grow wealth and grow generational wealth. Not having access to these things have placed, so many families, in a situation where they are. So for anyone to say, well, why aren't you successful, or why don't you have this, or why can't you have that? They are intentionally removing the existence of systematic racism and the history of slavery, because they know what happened and they know what is happening. But it's up to us now as a people to basically say, this is how we're going to build our local economies. This is how we're going to move forward. There are going to be challenges, yes, but building off of history and knowing where we were and knowing the things that we've gone through and how we can get out of it, I think will definitely help us in that situation.
I think the biggest hurdle that you have to overcome when you move past just it being a victim thing and understanding where we are now, and when you say the relationship to it, right? So the biggest analysis, or the biggest analogy that you can use is the education system, right? Where in today's country, you have $23 billion more that's poured into white education than Black education, which is a direct effect of the criminal justice reform that ends up happening, because you're not pouring any dollars into education and opportunities in the Black community. So you have a 23 billion, we're talking about, this is 2020, 2021 stats, where 23 billion annually is going to the education of white youth over the education of our Black youth, which is a direct reflection of the prison, school to prison pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mitch?
Yeah, I agree with definitely Scotty, because I was talking to a city councilman out in California, right? He said 75% of the kids that go to prison don't even have a high school diploma, right? And so if you ever hear me speak, I talk about how education help reduce crime, help increase job opportunities, create two-parent households, create entrepreneurs. right? It reduces abortion. I mean, that's the one metric that you can use to help reduce a lot of those things that systemically affects the Black community. And we were deprived of that, right? You look at housing, you look at education, you look at mass incarceration, you looked at in some administrations they had crack cocaine pushed into Black communities. And so you created crime, you created violence, you created addiction. So whenever you put all the bad stuff in these communities and then you tell them to pull themselves up by the bootstrap, that's just very short-sighted. And so that's why I think it's important to have a comprehensive conversation around solutions and how you move the culture forward.
Yeah. I believe I didn't disagree with anybody so far. Everybody's been on point. And like I told you, I have a good friend of mine who's white, and we've had this back and forth conversation all the time. Oh, you work hard, you'll just be successful. But then when I start really diving deep into our conversation, I looked at the school, the elementary school he went to, and then I look at the elementary school I went to. On a scale of 1 to 10, mine was a 3. Back then, it's still a 3 now. His was a 7 or 8. Then I started talking about after school programs. I started talking about the things that my kids have in their school versus the school that I went to versus the school he went to. It was a huge difference in the value of education. So it seems like even when I even bring those elements up, you're a few steps ahead of me just on that aspect alone. So, and it just seems like people don't want to acknowledge that. They just want to wipe away the history and say that was back then, and everything from right now, it's fair. You just work hard and you'll be successful. The people who's not successful is at their own doing because they don't work hard. So it's hard to have those conversations when you got people who really, a lot of people and I'm not a big political guy when it comes down to right and left. I think there's a whole lot of game in that system. I think the diversity is it's intended. So the division, not the diversity, the division is intended. So it just seems like when I'm having these conversations, more of the right has more of that mindset of the victim mentality versus the left. And I figure out now, how do we overcome that when you got people that don't even want to acknowledge that? We're in a society that we know we got some issues. We figure out we all discussing those issues right now. But when you got a large portion of the population that believes that it's just due to laziness, where do we make strides? How do we fix that problem?
Well, some of the pushback I get, Joe, because they say, look, that's the past. What's stopping you today? Right. And so, and you think about it in very, very simple terms like that. But when you look at all the economics and the statistics in the Black community, whether it's housing, I think Mr. Thompson brought that up. When you look at the household network, I think it's 184,000 for our white counterparts. In the Black community, it's about 23,000. When you look at the poverty rate in the Black community, it's 19% for a 13% population, but for our white counterparts, it's 8% for roughly 70% population, right? 65% population. So those numbers have a history, right? They're meaningful. They come from somewhere, right? And that's a representation of all of the issues and obstacles that the Black community has faced. Now, when we start addressing some of these issues, we realize that everybody's better off. 64, 65 Act, white women was able to vote. They got their rights restored. You look at Black Americans got their full civil rights. And so when we start addressing these issues in the Black community, when we can start, educating other people who may be opposed to it to realize that, hey, when African Americans get their full rights, everybody in this country is better off. And so when you look at Obamacare, right, that was stigmatized to be, a Black agenda-based policy because it came out of Barack Obama, but many white Americans benefited from that. Many conservatives and Republicans benefited from that. So when we start addressing these issues, we're so far at the bottom that everybody actually participates when you address those issues in the Black community.
And, economic wealth, building economic wealth has to be the basis for us to jumpstart a new cycle. I held a panel discussion just earlier this month celebrating the excellence and history of Black entrepreneurship, where we discussed many aspects on how we grow the Black economy, how we grow Black economics, and how we can get Black people to buy from Black businesses, right? In our communities, and we know it because we see it, there are many non-Black businesses in our communities that we patronize. So our disposable income and discretionary dollars are not being circulated in these in our respective communities. It's being spent with non-Blacks, right, who take the money out of our communities and take it back into their communities. Now, the circulation of dollars in the Black community only takes about 6 hours before it leaves, right? If you look at the Jewish community, it's about 28 days. If you look at the white community, it's about 17, 18 days. Their dollars circulate much more, for a longer time in their communities than us. It's only 6 hours. So one of the questions I pose on my panel is, can we replicate pre-1921 Greenwood? Can that happen, right? Can Black communities in America be replicated, can be replicated from the Greenwood Tulsa community? Now, if you look at Stonecrest, out in the Stonecrest area, where there's a Black Wall Street mall established with Black-owned businesses, it is incumbent on our community to spend the money with those businesses so that the dollars, the discretionary income, is circulated within our communities. That's one way in which we can establish the economic strength in our communities, is making sure that we are spending our dollars, the majority of our dollars, with Black-owned businesses, and that way we can help contribute to the generational wealth of our communities.
Ken?
Joe, you brought up, how do you have a conversation with somebody who's just saying, hey, pull somebody up. They just got to work hard and everything will be fine. I mean, the first question is probably, are they on equal footing? Do they have the same opportunities? But of course not. I mean, come on. It's when you're born with multiple figures already established, or you've already got things set aside before you come out of the womb. Your starting point. You've started in an advanced, way ahead of most people. Because you got the dollars there. So it's an understanding too of history. How did the Rockefellers get there? They didn't just get there. They didn't win the lottery overnight and get there. There's a whole history about how they got to where they are now. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the generational wealth that they've got. Again, so to say, hey, we just have to work hard and everything will be fine. Okay, yeah. So I don't want to discourage anybody from working hard and trying to save money and doing the right thing. But you have to also understand, it's not just slavery and then everything was great. Again, it's people don't understand all the stuff that happened after slavery, with the redlining, with the FHA, saying, hey, you can't live here. You have to live in this community, and white people can go live in this other community. So what that did is it had this compounding effect of inflating the home prices for in the white community, while deflating the home prices in the communities, in the yellow or red districts that they say how they segregated things. And so it's understanding, again, it's not the history of now. You have to understand history. If you don't understand the history, then of course it's going to make sense. Just work hard and everything will be fine. I've got the same opportunity as my neighbor. Well, the problem is your neighbor probably looks a lot like you. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That's just the reality of where we're at.
Yeah, I would piggyback on Ken and say, like for me, for example, I'm the first generation that can really change the game for my family, right? My mom was born in the 50s. That was before civil rights. And I grew up in New Orleans during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, right? New Orleans at the time was a murder capital. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of violence, a lot of incarceration around, crack and drugs just being pushed into the community. And so, but luckily I was able to go from one of the worst schools to one of the best schools in New Orleans, St. Augustine High School, just because I can play a little ball, right? So that's why I push. So when people ask me why you can't just pull yourself up by your bootstrap, I would say why we can't just address resources, opportunities, exposing kids to something positive, because we expose the Black community to a lot of negative, right, and a lot of systemic issues. Let's talk about recreational sports. Let's talk about mentorships, big brother, big sister programs, 2-year trade schools, 4-year colleges, things of that sort. I believe that if you expose kids to that, you're going to see much more of a positive outcome. As I mentioned, in California, the city councilman I was speaking to out there, the one metric that he was using was just getting kids to graduate with a high school diploma. 75% of the kids there that went to jail did not even have a high school diploma. So it always roots back to education. So, and then it goes back to the systemic things that we talked about: redlining, education, housing, and drugs. That's what really held back the Black community.
I think you just have to ask a simple question to those type of people. I think you have to ask them, are we at a place of equality across the board? Does America treat Black and white people the same equally? Do we have equal opportunities? And if you can't be honest about that with that response, then there's no need to even have an honest conversation, because you're stuck in the mindset of you don't want to learn. You're not willing to even understand or comprehend another person's perspective of what they're going through.
Well, Scotty, I think that's kind of one of the problems that Joe was talking about. The person who's going to just say everything's hunky dory, they may not have an understanding of the different communities. And what Mitch was talking about too, about the education. You have the GI Bill that took place after World War II. And because there was segregation, because there was, the Jim Crow laws that were still in the South, and then still, the Black veterans, they didn't get the same opportunities for education as the white veterans did. And, if you went to college, there's a greater likelihood that your kids are going to go to college. If you didn't go to college, there's not the likelihood of your kids going to college, or the following generations going to college, as Mitch is just talking about right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mitch, but you're breaking the mold. That's difficult to do. That's hard. Period. It doesn't matter if you're whatever color you are, but you have to understand that the different programs that were implemented, whether they didn't necessarily say, hey, with the GI Bill, we're gonna be racist in this bill. No, the way the bill was crafted there was no racial element to it, but how it was administered wound up being it wound up benefiting the white veterans, and it did not benefit the Black veterans. And so if it benefited the white veterans, it also wound up benefiting their children. Now, we're not that far removed from World War II veterans. That's my grandfather, World War II veteran. That's not that long ago.
Right. I think that's the most important thing to understand, is we're not that far removed from any of this. We're really still in that generation hasn't died off just yet.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. I'm sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Hey, Ken, you a white male, you live in a predominantly white community?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I've got.
How's your neighbors? Like, you seem like to really understand. Do your neighbors have the same sentiment, or they're a little against what you say, or they agree or disagree with you?
Well, I'm careful to get into certain arguments with the neighbors just yet, but I can just tell from the conversations that they might see the world slightly different than I do, but that's we have different backgrounds, and I will say in the community that I live in, I don't want to give I'm not going to tell everybody where I live, but in the community that I live, we've got about 65 houses in this development. We've got a handful of houses that have minority children, this home included. And then we've got our neighbors. I can count 2 different neighbors who are from India. It's pretty much, everyone else looks like me, except they're probably thinner and have more hair.
Hey, Mitch, I got a question for you.
Sure.
During your conversation, you keep saying the Black community, and I think I understand what you mean, but my question to you and the rest of the panel is, why is a very small percent of our entire population that consists of the poor community, always referred to as the Black community. And it's always the negative stigma. When people think Black community, they think hood, they think poverty, they think crime. Where I think it was about 6 months ago, I did research on it. There's about 2 to 3 million that consist of that. We're over 44 million as an entire community of Blacks. And that's just on paper. That's on the census. But we are always referred to, when we say Black community, the poverty-stricken areas.
Yeah. So, Martin Luther King in the clip that we showed earlier, he talked about that. He touched on it. He talked about the Black stigma, right? The Black skin is a stigma, right? We're stigmatized. And so I think through media, I think through conditioning, societal conditionings that's happening in this country, it paints the Black skin with a broad brush. And so that's why we have to spend so much time trying to debunk, the Black on Black crime, Chicago, as if everybody lives in Chicago, as if everybody commits crime, as if everybody commits murder, right? And so that's definitely not the picture of Black America, right? And so we definitely get generalized a lot just because of just what Martin Luther King talked about, which is that Black stigma, and that's painting the Black community with a broad brush.
Yeah, for too long, the Black skin, the African, has had no value, little to no value in this country. I was looking at a video earlier today, and I had some back and forth in the comments, and it was a video of Ukrainians trying to get out of Ukraine into Poland, and all the white Ukrainians were allowed onto the trains, and there were like a group of Africans who were trying to escape too. I mean, they were living in Ukraine, they're trying to get out, but they were held back to allow all the other Ukrainians to board the train and escape into Poland. When they finally got to the border, now they were not let into Poland, and the back and forth that my comments generated were, well, why are you concerned about that? Well, I'm assuming the person doesn't really understand the devaluation of Black people in this country, or Black people anywhere, right? Where it is perceived that if you're Black, then you're less valuable, right? Because here we have people who are escaping an invasion, but we'll let everybody else go except, those Africans. Here in America, we have Black and Hispanic families who are being removed from their communities and displaced because of gentrification. They're being removed and displaced because of development. We have apartments and homes that are being sold and from which families are removed because developers want to come in and build $500,000 homes and $700,000 homes. And then we ask, well, and then they say, well, we do have affordable housing, but affordable for whom? So again, here's another attack on a group of people classified as minorities because of the devaluation of African people or dark-skinned people. That's a reality. Whether it's economics, whether it has to deal with homes, whether it has to deal with education, inserting critical race theory to take the history, the teaching of African history out of the schools because whites feel, a little bit uneasy speaking about the history. This is the reality, and these are real occurrences. When we look at how we are treated, how we are not looked at as a valuable people in this country or valuable contributors to society. This is a real thing. And how we have to solve it is we have to basically continue to be steadfast in building our own economy and standing firm on what happened historically and how we can change that, how we change the narrative from Black people being lazy and thugs and this and so on. So we got to control our own narrative and then, in order to build up our own communities and move ourselves forward. Because when I looked at that video, it was very disturbing, and it reminded me of what I see here in America too, especially with Blacks and Hispanic families literally being displaced and removed out of communities because rich white folk want to bring in $500,000 homes, $700,000 homes. We've lost jobs to COVID. We've lost jobs in other aspects. I mean, we have families who are struggling and can't afford to pay $1,500, $1,700 a month for rent or buy a $500,000 home. And who does that affect most? It affects us. So that is the reality we're facing too.
Yeah.
See, Austin, I've got a question. Right, when you're talking about people coming in and building expensive homes, is that because of eminent domain, or is that just people, BlackRock or somebody coming in, some massive investment group going, yeah, we want to buy this land and redevelop it?
It can be eminent domain, but a lot of what I'm seeing is developers coming in. They're going to offer, okay, so the face value of the property, right? The true face value of the property is never offered to the homeowner. Right. So they'll say, hey, I'm going to offer you this amount of money, right? Knowing that the family is going to be like, oh my God, I've never seen this much money before in my life, all at one time, right? Not accumulated over time, but all at one time. And they're going to go for it, knowing that they're going to buy that house from that family at maybe 8, 9, 10 times less than what it's really worth. And then they do that in an entire community, right? And then they bring in homes and developments that people really can't afford to live in. So what they're actually doing is that they're trying to change the demographics of the community, because where you have your legacy residents, the residents who've lived in the community for generations. So where are you going to find if the median household income is $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in your community, and you're building these hyperinflated costs for homes, where are you getting those residents from? Everybody has to be imported. It's only people who can afford those homes are going to be imported into those communities, further contributing to the displacement of those legacy families who've lived in those communities for generations.
Okay. I think the eminent domain question is pretty easy to just stop that. I think the one that's more difficult is going to be if I'm a homeowner, and I've never seen the value of my home might be, $200,000, and someone comes in and offers me 160, writes a check, here you go tomorrow. I can see where that would be difficult to, you've never seen that amount of money. And so you're starting to think of all these different opportunities, things that you could do with the money. How do you prevent that? I am genuinely curious about, what are your thoughts, or what kind of thoughts do you have on maybe dissuading or stopping that, or what do you do about that?
That goes back to lack of education. I think that's the direct effect of a lack of education. Sometimes, I understand gentrification does happen, but at this day and age, I do understand that there are opportunities that we all have these computers in our hands, and we all have close to it as level playing field is going to get in society currently. So at some point in time, we have to take the opportunity to educate ourselves. But I think even to go back to the initial question about the negative connotation of the Black community, I think at this point in time, we've praised that negative connotation. We've accepted that for so long. We've tried to embody that. A lot of times you have kids who are coming out, who are the ones that may have been one generation removed from the projects, but they still want to be so street. They still want to be so tough that they end up taking the family backwards and end up going to, because they want to feel like they still come from that struggle. So we've embraced this struggle and made it our struggle so much that people pretty much live in that is what the Black community is, because we've embraced it to a certain extent. And so I think you have to accept responsibility on what we're putting into our youth, and giving them the tutelage to really want to be better and excel, to have a better playing field.
And so I asked to Scotty, I think if you had somebody who was sitting on the opposite end of this conversation, it would bring up hip hop, right? And how hip hop plays a huge role in influencing and projecting some of these negative stereotypes in the Black community, right? And so, I go right back to education because I listen to hip hop, right? And I don't go out and I don't shoot, I don't gang bang, and
Right.
I don't do those things because I can decipher art from, from real life. And so when you look at what Deion Sanders is doing down at Jackson State, I mean,
Beautiful.
he's changing the game literally,
Yes.
right? He's changing the landscape of college football. And also he's really putting Jackson State on the map. And he's doing that through hip hop, right? He's brought in several rappers, he brought in several artists, he's listening to music, and he's embracing the culture. So that's just one example where you can separate art from real life and not let something like hip hop be a negative tool, but it could be something positive. Like we can turn things and flip it. And so so if you hear some of the opposition, they would definitely bring up hip hop as being a strong negative influence on the Black community.
I think you definitely are correct. They will always bring that up, right? But there's also a consumer-based market that you have to really pay attention to, right? What are we feeding into as our culture? What are we really putting a staple on as our culture? It's not too much positive. It's the reality TV shows. It's the jewelry. It's the bling. It's the things that really don't have any significant value. It's materialism. And we're breeding that into our culture. We have a broken generation, a generation that had really a huge impact by all of the mass incarceration. That broken generation is now raising a generation that's lost because they're trying to heal at the same time as trying to raise their kids in the same moment. So you have two different generations that are crossing paths, which will ideally not have any positive influence because you have a whole generation of kids that grew up broken through this hip hop, and now they're raising their kids lost and broken as well.
That's very much true, Scotty, because when you look at because if we start addressing hip hop, you got to address all the other elements in society, right? You got to address movies and TV shows, right?
Right.
And all these other different elements that could be influential. So that's why I don't put so much clout into that. I put a great deal into, education. Again, I've been to concerts like to Kevin Gates, and I've been there, and there's no blacks in sight. there's you thought you walked into a Prince or Michael Jackson concert. And I was like, man, these guys, I thought I was going to need security. And so, but I didn't. It was just a pleasant group of people enjoying the concert, and everybody went home and nobody left that concert to gangbang. And so I just think, there's a difference between art and life. And so I also would say one more piece, Scotty brought up taking responsibility. I think we do have, a lot of heavy lifting within the Black community to take responsibility to try to push things forward as well, right? We could talk about resources and opportunities, but we also, this is where the bootstrap come in, and then we're not excluding that. That's always been part of trying to move the needle forward, is taking personal responsibility. I know one time I seen a kid, he was sagging his pants, and I was driving down the street, and I said, let me turn, I'm gonna talk to this kid. And I parked, and I walked up to the kid, and I said, hey, look, I'm coming to you respectfully. I parked my car, but I noticed when I was driving that I noticed your pants were sagging really, really low. And I said, if you don't notice, I'm a banker, but even you represent me as a banker. I represent you as well. It's unfortunate, it's unfair, but we carry the burden of representing each other as a Black community. And so just because we've been stigmatized so badly, that's what it comes to. And so I told this kid, I will pay you $20 if you don't mind pulling up your pants. And so the kid did. I gave him $20. I said, man, I appreciate that, man. Thank you. Hopefully you think about me next time. You may decide to wear a belt next time. So he laughed it off. He had a good time. But I think that's just an example where, we do have to take responsibility and try to play our part as well.
Mm-hmm. And I also chime in at the bottom, someone said something about our neighborhoods being dangerous, right? I think, first off, it's not about the neighborhoods being dangerous. A lot of times our neighborhoods are over policed, and these are not crimes of danger. Most of the time, police officers don't fight crime or violent crime, but crimes of poverty. You're talking about traffic tickets. A lot of times people get traffic tickets, they go to court, they get fined about a lot of BS things, a headlight being out, just being pulled over, crimes of poverty. Poverty is the biggest crime that the criminal justice system continues to implicate. Homeless people just going in and out to keep this revolving door going of free labor. That's an essential runoff of the slavery. So you're trying to get the cheap manual labor, keep these private prisons that make $400 million a year through cheap labor, through quote unquote prisoners, which is in fact slavery, another slavery system all over again. But the cheap petty crimes that continue to be crimes of poverty, that continue to keep people, when you have a continuous lack of opportunities, and then you have that revolving door of people, once they do go to jail, they're going right out into probation and then parole and going right back in. You got 66% of people that are repeat offenders because you're not giving them a better opportunity. You're not even giving them any type of rehabilitation at all, because you're using them to get your cheap labor.
Yeah, Scotty, you're 100% right, and that's coming from the law enforcement end, because we should do crime analysis maps, and we would light up the map where you had your robberies, you had your crimes at. If you look at where those red dots at, and a lot of people probably seen it on CSI or whatever police show they have, if you look at where those dots are, it's all in the poor community. The majority of it is in the poor community. So you are 100% right. Police don't really kill crime. They don't, because crime been in those communities long before we been even born. That poor community has always had those same issues. So we've had police numbers high, police numbers low. Crime just fluctuates in that particular community. So history shows that police they don't wipe away crime.
Because policing is a response to crime.
Right. So if you look at the problem, it's poverty. So my thing is, if we take care of poverty, you take care of all those red dots out of those particular neighborhoods. And a lot of people don't understand that concept. Like, even when I did some research on poor schools, failing schools, if you look at the neighborhoods those schools are in, it represents that same community. It's poor community. So when you don't have money for educational system, right? What kind of educational system or education that you're giving from a poor community? So we need to really look at, right, these issues on how the solutionary responses to these problems is to clean up the poverty issue. People think reparations, go out giving out checks. I tell people all day long, take that neighborhood school, and turn it into a 10. I guarantee you will see a huge decline when they start dealing with crime, because education is probably the most factor to pull those bootstraps up and get out from a bad situation. So poverty, take care of that, and you take care of the crime problem.
But I think even to go even deeper and diving into that is us getting more involved in our local politics. A lot of people don't know who sits on the school board, who makes those decisions about the budget for your school. We don't get into state government enough. We only stay on the federal level most times when it comes to governing. And a lot of times the issues that we have within our communities cannot be decided by a federal election. So we need to get really involved with county commissioners, understanding those positions, agricultural commissioners, public service commissioners, insurance commissioners, utilities. I mean, things that we really have in our day-to-day infrastructure of our lives. We don't really understand enough as a community the political education point of voting. Everyone just vote, and then they always end up upset at Biden or whatnot. But we have to really dive into county government, city government, and state government to have those laws changed in our favors. And a lot of times those elections have very, very, very low voter turnout, where a lot of times the kids today have more Instagram followers, or the kids in high school get more votes for homecoming queen than the person who's elected in their district.
Yeah, I got a question for Councilman Thompson. I come from the project, right? And I looked at my school back then on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 3. And I looked at it just recently, it's still 3. It fluctuates between 4 and 3. Now, when I had this discussion about how do you change that school into a much greater success, money, how do you expect, right, a poor community, because schools are funded by their community tax base. How do you take a poor community to fund their education when that community itself is hurting for resources, money? You don't have a huge tax base in that particular community. So how are we going to fund the school with no money?
Right. A tax base is one part of the funding source, right? The other thing, I know we talked about voting a few minutes ago. Local elections are important because electing school board members who will work in your favor are important. County commissioners, very important. There's a lot of funding. There's millions of dollars in funding that comes down federally to the state level and to the county level, right? When you have a school board that has representation that looks like those in the county or in the city or in the jurisdiction, and understands, like for instance, I come from low income housing. I come from the inner cities of New York. When I was canvassing and when I was knocking doors, introducing myself to the community and engaging the residents, I went throughout the low income community. Every door in the low income community was knocked. And so they looked at me as a politician, as somebody who's come to get their vote, who's going to go in, do the same thing like the last guy. I had to convince residents that, look, let me share something with you. Don't let this suit and this tie and this attire fool you. I come from the Louis H. Pink House projects in East New York, Brooklyn, right? I come from the inner cities of New York. I know what you are going through. Representation matters. When I was able to make that connection with those residents, you could see the change in their faces. You could see the change in their tones of voices. When we have representation on whether it's the school board or county commission, now we can get much needed dollars redirected to our schools, right? You talk about the school on a level of 3, then and now, right? Maybe you didn't have your school district didn't have the right representation on these boards, but representation matter. On our school board here in Gwinnett County, we have diverse representation. We have school board members that are fighting to have the funding in the schools that would get these students the resources they need. So representation matters. Voting matters, right? Voting matters. And then when people say, "Oh, I don't vote because this doesn't happen," when you don't vote, the people who have no concern for you get elected. When you insert yourself into the process, not just as a voter, but getting out and helping to knock doors, helping to raise funds, you get the people who are really concerned about your community involved, and get them elected. So having the representation matters. Having the representation of county commissioners, of school board representatives, who will make sure that you get the proper funding, that matters. Because I know the individuals I am working with in my county, in my school board, and trust me, they are working to make sure that students in these high schools and these middle schools are getting the necessary funding they need.
Yeah.
If I can add to that, Joe, if you don't mind,
Go ahead.
I echo a lot of what Mr. Austin Thompson just laid out. I also would add that, to address the schools, you really got to address just the community issues as a whole, right? Because as you mentioned, Joe, a lot of the funding comes from taxation of the housing, right? The property values in that particular community. So if we don't address home ownership, first-time home buyers, right? If we don't address the violence in the community, gang violence, if we don't address drug addictions, right? If we don't address maybe trade schools opportunities or recreational sports opportunities or big brother, big sister programs, if we don't address the community from a multi-step solution, I guess, viewpoint, then you never going to be able to, because you can't just address schools by itself. You can't just have a perfect school in a bad neighborhood, right? You got to address the community as a whole. So I think when we start addressing some of the school issues, I think we have to look at it from a broader approach.
Yeah, I agree with you. I definitely agree with that. It's just not a one-faceted answer. it's a combination of everything that you named. So
'Cause Joe, how would you describe your community there today versus now? You said back when you grew up, it was a 3. Today is a 3. How would you describe the community? Is it still, a very difficult community to live in?
It's crazy because the last time I went back and I was visiting, right directly across the street, they was tearing down and building up expensive condos. Like, and I was just like, they're about to do something major to this particular. You're not going to put $1 million condos right across the street from the projects unless you have a plan to do something with these projects. So it was just amazing to see the construction that was going on directly across the street from the projects.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I volunteer as a mentor at Discovery High School. And at Discovery High School, every semester, I'm asked to come in and outside of politics, I'm a consultant. So I come in and I judge business plan competitions. I judge marketing plan competitions. I sit in classrooms with students as they're working in their projects, and I advise them and I offer feedback. And, one thing with these kids in a Title I school, I volunteer in a school that has a STEM program, a STEM academy, not a program, an academy, right? Has Health and Human Services Academy, Media and Communications Academy, and the Business and Entrepreneurship Academy, right? And they put money into training these young people and giving them the skills, the necessary skills and acumen that will help them to either create businesses or to go out and get a job immediately after high school if they so choose to take a gap year or not go on to college right away. So at least they have the skills. So I've seen the funding come to these schools, right? Right now, my videos are being edited by a high school sophomore who's going to be a junior next year. And she does a phenomenal job because they have the technology and the resources in the school that trains her. These young people get certifications. They're certified in these particular areas so that when they leave school, they have the opportunity now to become, financially comfortable if they don't want to go immediately on to college. And they also have the requisite skills to take into college and at least have a head start, right? So, the community, the high school reaches out into the community. It gets these business owners like myself, consultants like myself. They leverage the expertise from companies to come in and say, hey, we want you to be a part of the school system. We want you to come in and help mentor these young people. If you are an accountant, mentor them and teach them what is an accountant? What do you do as an accountant? If you're an engineer, if you're a software developer, so on and so forth. That's what happens when these things happen when you have the representation that's needed in these communities. I didn't have that in my high school, I'll tell you that, So these young people in schools like this, we have another high school, Central Gwinnett, they're pumping money into that school, and these kids are really getting the exposure that's needed in order for them to be successful beyond high school, whether they go right into college or if they take a gap year or, stay out of college for a little bit before they go in. So it takes the community. It takes the community to work with the teachers, the educators, the students, in order for this to happen.
Nice. Ken, you got anything?
I've just got, obviously I didn't grow up in that community. I've just got to, trying to find solutions to these things. What are some, are there like alternative schools, alternative options for different communities to be involved in? Charter schools, and I don't know. I'm not that educated on the topic. So what are the pros and cons of that? I just saw what they've done in New York with some of the charter schools.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it. New Orleans is the biggest experiment for charter schools. Right after Hurricane Katrina, 95% of the schools in New Orleans is charter school.
Wow.
However, yeah, but as I mentioned, New Orleans has a job issue, right? The economy is built on tourism, right? So it has a crime issue as well. And so, you have to address some of these issues outside of schools to help these communities kind of flourish, because they all have to be working on full cylinders, right? You can't just have one. If you got an offense, right? If you got a good quarterback, if you don't have good receivers and a good running back and an offensive line, your offense can't go. That's how I think about the community. And so, but New Orleans has played with the charter school. I've read some reports where they have, inch better compared to like the regular public school model. Wasn't a dramatic difference, but it have shown some positive improvements as it relates to New Orleans.
And how do you motivate investment in different communities?
I'm sorry.
Another question I've got, and I was just kind of thinking about this, is that, if I've got $1 million, why would I put that into that community versus another investment option?
Yeah, good question, Ken. That's where, opportunity zones plays a huge part, right? It gives you a tax incentive to want to invest in these communities.
I don't have $1 million to invest, by the way. But
so the second piece, you got to think, when you start gentrifying these communities, your biggest return is in these inner cities. And so I have a buddy of mine who solely invests in the communities that he grew up in. He doesn't live in these communities. He still wants to invest back into the Black communities because your rate of return is so much higher, right? You start, as Joel mentioned, they building a new high rise. Just imagine how much they probably paid for that land, right?
Yeah, nothing.
And you're not going to go to, the best part of the city, right? Because it's going to be a lot more expensive. So there's a big return on your investment through the gentrification process. And so if we can create more entrepreneurs, better business owners, getting kids to graduate, we can all participate in that gentrification process. So that's to hopefully I answer your question out, Ken.
No, I think so. I think that one of the things that happens is when people hear gentrification, good or bad, if I've got some money to invest, I don't know if I want to take part in gentrification, because I'm hearing that it's bad. But it's an opportunity for it to be something good.
Well, it's bad in the sense that the people in the community get left out, right? And so we're not taking part in that process. But like in New Orleans, one of the biggest issues with Hurricane Katrina, in New Orleans, there's a big thing. We just transfer homes. We just give it to the grandparents, give it to their kids and to their kids, and it's never properly transferred properly through the deed process or through probate. And so when Hurricane Katrina kicked in, you had all these homes that wasn't properly deeded right, and they could not sell these homes. They could not collect FEMA funds for it. So it just created a lot of havoc for it. So part of that's education, making sure that when we buy homes, we buy it properly, we transfer it properly, put it in a will, put it in a trust. If someone passes away, it's properly transferred over. And we need to create more homeowners, right? I think a lot of the issues with the gentrifications, we have so many renters in these communities. We've been renting, and then the rent goes up and we get squeezed out, right? And so, but I look at my home. I grew up from very humble beginnings. My mom's first home was $26,000. I'm still trying to buy it today. Small home, 900 square feet. That home right now is $125,000. But my mom, right, again, she grew up in the 50s. She never owned a home before. It was a lease to own, and she could not keep up with the payments. $400 a month. She raised 4 kids on a $23,000 salary.
Right.
And so we lost the home. Just imagine we'd have kept that home in the family. That's $100,000 in appreciation. So I wouldn't mind gentrification, because I love for somebody to come and tap me and say, hey, your house is worth $175. We give you $225 because we want to build these new skyrise. Right? That's a great return on your investment. So that's just one example that we can participate in gentrification but we really have to put some home ownership tools in place, and we have to put some education solutions in place as well.
I had missed one little part. I heard y'all talking. It wouldn't let me back in. About the school system. I believe that what y'all talking about. Like maybe like 2 minutes. And my biggest thing to that would be there's this new, I won't say it's new education, but it's a new method of education that wasn't around when I was being educated, of social emotional learning. And I think if we can really get that implemented in the Black community, we struggle with our ability to control our emotions. And we really struggle with that very deeply. We make very irrational decisions out of anger, out of split thinking moments, and out of trying to show we're tough. We have the stigma of Black people that we have to be tough all the goddamn time. And we don't have to be tough all the time. And we haven't overcome that mental makeup. It's social emotional learning is like the introductory level of mental health, where you're talking to kids and parents about the whys and what they think and how they transform their opinions and their thought processes. And I think the mental makeup of our community is the beginning stages, because we've been so traumatized for so long and we haven't necessarily fully healed to begin the process of loving one another, to do something like economic empowerment, you know what I mean, group economics, to get to a point where we love each other strong enough to believe in one another. We've been in survival mode for so long, and we've just been trying to get a step ahead of ourselves. We've been trying to hold on to what we got before we can help anyone else. But I work with my father's a therapist. He works, it's called a safe space, and I work in the social emotional learning aspect of it, which teaches about social awareness, self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision making, and relationship skills. All of these can be implemented in skills as life skills as well, that you can carry on for the rest of your life. And if you learn these things at a very early age, studies show that they can implement it as young as 4 or 5 years old. And you can watch over the next 15 years the transformation of one's mind and how they think and how they become more compassionate for other people and how they actually listen and understand the emotions of other people to make better decisions for themselves.
So I'll add to Scotty, if I can, Joe, if you don't mind. So what Scotty pointed out is crucially important. He's talking about mentorship in a way, right? And so, and I preach mentorship because that's crucially important. I grew up without a dad, but I played sports. So I had a lot of coaches, male coaches that come in my life that took a really good liking to me. They understood my story, understood my humble beginnings, and they wanted to see me be successful. And so I was able to pitch a lot of my struggles and my adversities with these coaches, and they was able to kind of point me in the right path. And so when we hear people who says pull yourself up by the bootstrap, the second thing that they always pitch is, well, fatherless homes is our biggest issue, right? And so, and I always ask, so what's the solution? If you don't have a father today, we can't clone a dad, right? We can't make a dad. We can't make the dad come back into your life. We had to put in programs, which is what Scotty is talking about, which is mentorship programs, right? And so that way some of these kids have some guidance and some direction from people who have been able to navigate. Joe, you'd be a great mentor. Like Ken could be a great mentor, right? And so because these kids need somebody to turn to, I needed it. And that's what helped change the path in my life.
Can I say this? As we talk about fatherless homes, we have to first off address the issue that was systematically planned by the government to take fathers away from the home. So we can't just always talk about the effect without getting to the cause of the problem. Mm-hmm. And until we address the causes of how we get here, then we can't move forward because we're skipping over the steps. We're just sweeping under the rug as if, like that's a little joke. Oh, Black kids don't have fathers. But why don't they have fathers? How did we get there? How many times did y'all have drug raids in that community? How many times did y'all have roadblocks that was pulling over somebody with a suspended license? That was just trying to get to work and took them out of an opportunity to be successful. So it really has to be identified as a problem first off. And that's the biggest thing within this systematic oppression that I see, is that we don't like to address where the root of the problem begins in order to start healing the problem. Like if we don't want to, we can't just talk about the issue and say, oh, this is what's wrong, without understanding how we got to that point, which to Ken's point is the historical context of it. but also being able to say where the history lays us right now and how those trends affect us at this very moment to move forward. And like I said, we've become a broken generation because of the mass incarceration era of really cracking down and putting Black people in jail for profit.
And not only the little traffic, you got to understand, a part of that system, that same system that's supposed to be a temporary system to help you get on your feet, a lot of the qualifications, the men couldn't even be in the house. You couldn't even have men in the house to qualify for a lot of the assistance. I've seen that happen, play a huge impact on the poor Black family coming up. Oh, if you got a male in the house, then you don't qualify for this. So it always had to be the mother and her children. So let's not forget about that as well, because the system, to me, it was horrible. And I think me and
it was remove the Black male from the household.
Yeah. Me and Mitch was just talking about, it's supposed to be a temporary stop for you to get to the next financial status of your life, right? You're poor, you need a helping hand. Here, this is what we're gonna do for you to help you get to that next step. But there was never a blueprint to get to that next step. It was a bunch of restrictions. And I was talking to Mitch earlier this past week about how my mother, she had 5 children. She went out and tried to work. And then once she made $1 more than the requirement to get on that, to get the assistance, they was threatening to take it away. Like that $1 would automatically put us into another tax bracket that we can go afford to move somewhere else. So the system was designed, it was like a fail system. And people don't really understand the system, because a lot of the people who have problems about the system was never on the system. They don't understand how it works. They don't have these experiences. So you created a system designed to keep me exactly in that same situation, because as soon as I go over $1, you cut me off. And like, that's going to put me into another community. So we really need to understand, like you said, the mechanics of why we're here. We need to go back to figure out exactly what brought us to this point.
I think the biggest piece is political education, because we're governed and we're abused by the system more than anybody, but we don't know each and every facet of the system. We don't know who to hold accountable for what. We don't know who that decision maker is within Section 8 that has allotted that law to be in place. You know what I mean? We don't know that state representative that voted on that law to be in place. We don't know the labor commissioner that hasn't changed the minimum wage in Georgia in 20 years. We don't know who that person is. And so these things that affect us, we have to have political education to understand the potential to overturn a system, to manipulate the system in our favor, is the political education aspect of what's really happening on all levels. And like I said, I'm getting involved with lieutenant governor's races this year and attorney general races this year and the mayor's race of Atlanta. And so I'm able to see these things and try to take it and bring representation to my community in the aspect of political education to understand that these things affect your life. And we can't continue to have ignorant conversations and think Joe Biden is the reason for everything in our community.
Yeah, you sound like a candidate for council right now.
That's what they say. I like to influence the elections. I'm real proud, man. They get messy out there. Joe, you know they get messy. They got too many street ties to be doing all that now. You know? they get too messy. Somebody get hurt playing like that. They play politics. Politics is a dirty game. I don't like all that. They disrespectful. I like to be fair, you know. Hey, they do little. They resemble the streets a little bit too much not to get touched. That's all I can say. They walking that line, man. That's dirty game. I can't do all that.
Hey, Councilman,
I don't even play like
that. Any truth to what he's saying?
Hey, man, I'm here to serve the people. That's all.
Man,
I'm a public.
Ain't there no, Austin, what'd you say is no holds barred when it comes to election time? They don't care what they got.
Well, you know.
You got anything on your record, they going for it.
they going for it, and they will use it in order to gain leverage. And
yes.
It
could be 15, 20 years ago. It don't matter. They bring it up. You had in 2005, you slapped a security guard for calling your mom the B word. Like, you be like, I did. You a thug. You be like, what? Like, it's crazy, man. Like I've gotten to see the last 2 election cycles. I played a significant role in Paul Howard's situation with Fonnie Willis, and I knew that Paul Howard didn't stand a chance in that race because of what he had done over the history of Atlanta. But I did think he was a better candidate. And then being involved, I knew Andre Dickens 5 years ago from doing my own activism work with my SMART Foundation. And I just talked to Kwanzaa Hall. He's going to run for lieutenant governor. And I just introduced Christian Wise Smith for attorney general at his campaign rally 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So we're in that space. I'm just trying to educate the people that look like me about what affects them. Not necessarily wanting to run, but I'm actually in the process of writing a book called Misplaced Anger. And the book is about who do you talk to when you're upset about your utilities? Mm-hmm. You know, the public service commissioner, you know, and how long is his term and when is he up for election? And how much does he make? And how big is his budget to do that? We don't understand the things that are on a direct impact to our lives. We don't get that. Like I was talking about cities like College Park or South Fulton, where College Park, they had the same guy in office for 30 years. The black lady just came in office and she didn't have that many votes to win. It didn't take that much. And it's the ignorance that we're accepting at this point to not be a part of the process, because but what the problem is, the politicians aren't educating us. They're just telling you to go out and vote, and they're not understanding who's supposed to change what in the process.
Yeah.
So that's my job. My job is to educate us a little bit more about what the hell's going on.
Yeah, and that I mean, for the viewers, I'm about to close it in 5 minutes. So if you got a question for the panel, this is the time to ask. And Scotty, you're exactly right, man. I think for a long time, like, our community has been uneducated about the process, and the officials, I really believe, didn't care. They didn't care to educate us about the process. And I'm just going to take you back to I had a protection detail for elected officials, right? And we was at his campaign office, and he was actually, he's going over the strategy on his campaign. And what he did was he pulled all the precincts by voting numbers from the last voting cycle. And then he went from the precinct that had the most to the precinct that had the least. So he was like asking his campaign managers, okay, what are their concerns in that community? What are their concerns? And it was all based on the number of votes per precinct, depending on how he addresses that community. When he got down to the last 3 precincts, the manager was like, don't worry about it. And the numbers was low compared to the population of people. So he was like, if you want to drop leaflets over there, you can, but don't worry about it. If they don't vote, then why bother? So
why even complain?
So the whole it went on that he walked out. So they had all the maps on the table. So as I was walking out, because I was assigned his protection detail, so I was looking, and those 3 precincts was the poor black community. So when you look at how to get his attention is through the voting process. For a long time in that community, and I've been told time and time again as a young man growing up, as a young kid, why vote? It don't matter. They don't care about this. Nothing going to change. Why we vote? And they know that. So we're never a factor in that election cycle, because we don't understand how much of a factor we can be if we come together and start using our voting powers. But it's just one of those stigmas that been haunted our community for many years. So I'm glad that you are there in the community and you're constantly feeding the community the tools to actually make a difference. Because you want to get a politician's attention, you become a big factor in the voting process. You'll get his attention.
You got 5,000 people that's gonna show up to the polls. I bet you start listening.
Wow.
Yeah.
So definitely, did we get any questions, or we're gonna close it down?
I have a question for Mr. Thompson, if you don't mind.
Okay, go ahead.
Because he's a city councilman, and I just wanted to ask. I hear a lot from people that I'm not sure what your political affiliation is. I'm not sure if you're Democrat or Republican, but I hear a lot of pushback from like Republican organizations that say, hey, we want to be in the Black community. We want to help out. We want to do outreach, but we're not welcome. And I always say, have you reached out to the city councilman? What was your response? What kind of feedback did you get? Do you get people from the opposite party to kind of join hands with you to try to address some of the issues in the community? And then how do you think about community outreach as a whole? How much will that play into how you try to address some of the issues in your community?
I'm a progressive Democrat. I'm a proud progressive Democrat, have been one for 34 years. I reach out to Republicans. I have friends who are Republicans. When I was running for city council in 2019, I lost that race. I reached out to the community as a whole because I knew as a council member, we have about 32,000 residents in our city. If I won in 2019, I would be responsible for all 32,000 residents, regardless of what they look like and regardless of their party affiliation. I ran last year. I won the general election. I went back into those same communities again. I'll tell you about this. I have folks, regardless of political affiliation, that I converse with. I have folks come and talk to me because I tell them I ran a nonpartisan race, right? And the city council is a nonpartisan race. So we don't deal with partisanship. We deal with infrastructure. We deal with the city budget, making sure that, we have the money to manage the city and to fulfill our fiduciary responsibility. We deal with streetlights. We deal with pavements. We deal with, water and lights and so on and so forth. Anything that we need in order to manage the city effectively, that's what we do. It ain't Republican, it ain't Democrat, right? I reached out to the community and I let them know that. I had pushback from the other side because, the city is changing in demographics. So number one, there's a bit of discomfort with seeing somebody that looked like me, right? Running for city council and that could possibly sit on the city council, right? The second thing is I'm an immigrant. So, 2 strikes, right? The other thing is I was blocked from 4 cafes in my city, right? One, I had a tense back and forth about SB 202, right? And that's the voter restriction bill, right? And because I opposed SB 202, right? The owner of the cafe stated that I had no voter integrity because I was for allowing people the right to access the voting booth, right? The right to have people access the absentee ballot boxes and so on and so forth. All the things that the bill wanted to strip away, I was totally against, right? So I knew what that person represented, right? So my whole thing was I wanted to engage everyone in the city. He took that away from me at that venue, and the 3 others that never returned my call, they took that away from me. It was a Bosnian cafe that said, here's our facility. Whatever you want to do, we will accommodate you. So that's where I hold. At the time when I was running, I held coffee with candidate Thompson. Now that I'm elected, I hold coffee with Councilman Thompson twice a month. Every Saturday, you come in and we talk about the issues in the city. So yes, I've tried to engage the community, and I engage those who allow me to engage them. All right. It's all about representation. Again, it's all about being fair and showing that you have the willingness to build bridges. You have the willingness to tear down walls. And it's up to the individuals on the other side to be welcoming of your effort to do that. Now, I've been turned away from doors. I've been turned away from cafes. But I tell you what, I will continue representing my city the way I feel the city needs to be represented. And that's fair and equal representation. If I'm asking for a system to treat me fairly and equally, I have to return that. It's up to the other side to either accept it, embrace it, and if they don't, well, at least I offered myself.
That's good feedback. I appreciate that, Mr. Thompson.
Yes, sir. I always say be fair, for the fairness that you ask for, and for the inclusiveness that you ask for, give it. If they don't want to accept it, regardless of your affiliation, if the other side doesn't want to accept it, at least you've made the attempt to reach across and build that bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty good closure. You did an excellent job. I appreciate that. I'd like to thank the panel for coming out, taking the time to have this discussion. These are discussions that I really believe need to be had. So I thank y'all. Hopefully y'all come back. I do this every Sunday, and I just want to thank y'all once again. Everybody be safe and have a good night.
Joe,
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good speaking to you guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Be blessed.
Thanks, everybody.